So this is part 3 in our discussion of A Doll's House. And we talked a lot about kind of the time period because this was in the 1870s. We talk a lot about, roles for men and women and how different they were, and especially in traditional roles, and how the legal system kind of followed along with that. There were things that women couldn't do. They weren't allowed to own property. They weren't allowed to vote. They couldn't, in this case, they couldn't take out a loan or have a bank account without a male co-signer. So in what we found out in the last 2 sessions is that Nora had taken out a loan illegally. She actually had forged her father's signature, and it would be definite evidence in court, the promissory note would be, because she signed it to be dated the three days after he had actually passed away. And so it was definitely a forgery. So that kind of stuff is could get her put in jail. In this day and age, I mean, she'd pay a fine, do stuff like that. But at this point, she probably would be put in jail. A lot of our legal system today, we have a lot more safeguards to keep people from egregious, jail time. But she could definitely have been severely punished for this. So this is, and it would also reflect on her family, or reflect on her husband, Torvald, who is a bank manager of all things. If you're a bank manager, you do not want your wife to end up in jail for forgery. That's bad. So, but he doesn't know any of this. That's what we've established. So Nora has been hiding it for years from him, that she took out this loan, slowly paying it back, and hiding the fact that all the extra money she's supposedly a spendthrift about is actually money going back to the loan. But now we've hit a big problem. The person she has the loan with, Krogstad, is being fired by Torvald Helmer because of his past, in which he actually committed forgery and was not punished for it. And so he lost his job, and it was hard for him to get another job. But Torvald, to him, that's not enough. And so he's kind of talking about that very strict moral view. So he's talking about Krogstad, but what he doesn't know, and this is where dramatic irony, I'm going to type that in over in the chat box. Dramatic irony. We all know, because we've been sitting here in this, their living room or whatever it is for about an hour. We know that she took out the loan, and that she's been hiding it. We know why she did it. She actually did it to save Torvald's life, and she couldn't get her father's signature because he was dying himself. So she was in very, straitened circumstances. And so we understand why she did it, but she's still in trouble if she gets caught. But Helmer has no clue. He's just very black and white. Everything's right or wrong. And he's very severe and very judgmental. And so he talks about Krogstad, but we know as an audience that that Nora is going to take it as if he's talking about her. And so it's crucial that we understand this dramatic level of irony, because otherwise we don't understand her actions. So Helmer's talking about Krogstad, and he essentially says, well, he's still at fault because he didn't get punished for his crime. He got himself out of it by a cunning trick. And Nora's trying to argue with it, but very half-heartedly, mainly because Helmer won't let her get a word in. And he just starts spewing, in a way, about what happens when a man gets away with stuff like that. So just think how a guilty man like that has to lie and play the hypocrite with everyone, how he has to wear a mask in the presence of those near and dear to him, even before his own wife and children. Now, of course, everything he's saying about Krogstad, Nora's taking upon herself. So she's been for years lying and wearing a mask in the presence of her husband and children. And this is where he gets to the crux of it. And about the children, that is the most terrible part of all. And this should freak her out. And she goes, how? And he says, because such an atmosphere of lies infects and poisons the whole life of a home. Each breath the children take in such a house is full of the germs of evil. And this becomes self-judgment. So she's looking at what she has done, because remember, she committed the same crime. And is she infecting her own children? And she's going to start questioning her own behaviors and judging herself based on what Torvald says. And Torvald says, I've seen it so often. Almost everyone who's gone to the bad early in life has had a deceitful mother. And so she should take this and go, you know, it should be a gut punch for her. And then she says, why do you only say mother? And this is where he goes into, well, you know, women are the ones who take care of the babies. So, and it's the mother's influence. Now, I don't know if any of you guys are Harry Potter fans. You know that I am if you've been in my chats before. But one thing that and I'm going to use language, but it's meant to be actually signify female dogs, not the derogatory form for, you know, name for a female. But at one point in Harry Potter number 3, the Prisoner of Azkaban, there's an aunt who comes to visit, and she essentially says that Harry Potter is corrupt because of his mother. And she says, if there's something wrong with the bitch, that's the dog, there's something wrong with the pup. But it's the mother. It's always the mother. It's funny because I actually wrote my dissertation about this, even before Harry Potter ever came out. But it's this idea that the mother is if she's a far more corrupting influence because if she's bad. And the dad can be bad. He can even be mean. And yet I have the Elder Wand, which my son actually gave to me. And then I have Hermione's wand, which my daughter gave to me. And then I have another wand, and I don't remember which one I have. But yeah, I'm a huge Harry Potter fan. I just love good fantasy, and I love good young adult literature because that's what I write. And so I just love this stuff. But it's the whole idea though of you know, trashing the mom and, oh, she must have done something if her kid turns out bad. That's what he says. And Torvald has no basis in fact to say any of this. But he says, he goes, a bad father would have had the same result, but every lawyer is familiar with this fact. And that's what he says. I mean, it's not a fact. Plenty of kids turn out horribly when their parents were really nice. Plenty of kids turn out okay when their parents were not. Miss McGonagall. See, I like McGonagall because she has that Scottish thing going. I'm all about Scotland. And so he says, this Krogstad, of course, now she's going to take it as Nora has been persistently poisoning his own children with lies and dissimulation. That's why I say he has lost all moral character, because he's still fathering his children and corrupting them because he's bad. And so just being around his children is corrupting them and making them bad. Of course, who's going to take care of the kids? I mean, there's no logic in what he's saying because Krogstad's a widower. He has no wife. There's no one else who could take the children so that he wouldn't be an influence on them. And someone has to take care of them. And that's why he wants his job, so he can care for his children. And so it's a really mean thing to believe, and a mean way to judge a person. Like, how dare they be a parent on top of having done something wrong? And so then he turns, of course, to her and tells her, you have to promise me not to plead for him. And he goes, give me your hand. There, no, now that's settled. Almost like he patted her on the head. And he says, I assure you, it would be quite impossible for me to work with him. I literally feel physically ill when I'm in the company of such people. Now, if that's not prejudice, I do not know what is. Can a person who has been a convict do better? Yes. Statistically, yes. You know, do they always? No, but they absolutely can. And yet there are plenty of businesses that won't hire somebody because they've been convicted of something. And so, but it's again, this passing, I don't like, he doesn't even, he literally feels physically ill because when he's in the office and Krogstad's there. And that's ridiculous. And so Nora is essentially freaking out. How hot is it in here? I have such a lot to do. I better go finish decorating the tree because she's messed up. he has absolutely taken any moral compass she had and swiveled it around and said, no, you're actually an evil person. And you're a horrible, corruptive influence on the children. And he says, of course, I have to read through all these papers. Of course, most of them are papers for him deciding to fire people if he wants to. And it may not just be Krogstad. There may be other people. And he's just not even thinking about the fact that A, it's Christmas. You know, this is not the time to fire people. And B, what are the ramifications of that? What happens when you fire a person? What happens to their family? What happens to their livelihood? Can they get another job? And the truth is, I mean, we get judged, Jordan, all the time. And yet the people who are really judgmental are often the people who whine the most when they get judged. And yet, like, if you see what they post about people, they're so judgmental, but you say one critical word and they get all defensive. And that's the way Torvald would be too. Were she to say, Torvald, I don't think you're right, he would lose his mind. Because of course he's right. But these are not nice people. You know, Torvald, we established in the earlier session today that most people thought of him as kind of like the worst character in here. He's just meanest. It's because he's not thinking. He's thoughtless. He's not compassionate. He's not empathetic. He judges and judges and judges. And he's very bombastic. He talks a lot. So then he says, okay, and then I must think about your costume too. Remember, she talked to him about what she was going to wear the day after Christmas. And it's just possible I may have something ready in gold paper to hang up on the tree. And the question is it money? Because remember, that's what she asked for earlier. And then, of course, he puts his hand on her head and says, my precious little singing bird. Now, I'm taking this way longer. We've already spent like over 2 hours on this play, and the play itself would probably be a little over 2 hours. But I'm kind of piecing out these things because I want you to see the signs. And Nora, after he wanders off, after patting her on the head and calling her a bird, she says to herself, it isn't true. It's impossible. It must be impossible. And then the nurse comes in, says, hey, do you want to play? Because the kids want to play with you. Well, that's not how she says it. She says it very politely. And she says, no, 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 don't let them come into me. You stay with them, Anne. And the nurse is like, okay. And she's worried. She's going to hurt her children just by being around them because she has done what she has done. Even if she had good reasons or she felt like she had very justified reasons. And most of us honestly would understand. At this point in our lives, you know, here it is 100 and, I don't know, 50 years later. And we really would understand because we can now. Okay, so we'll talk about that when we get there, Tracy. But I don't either. And it's a hard thing to do, but we'll talk about why. And so if you don't end up in that chat, because it may be with my group, well, we can talk about, let's address that for a second, since hopefully anybody who's watching this has read it all already. When we get to the end and she leaves and she does not take her children with her. Okay, that's the number one thing I get when people read this. They're like, why didn't she take her kids? There are two reasons. One, she would never be able to care for them and make enough money to feed them. Not with her being a woman and having really no work experience. She's not Christine. Two, she would never legally be allowed to have children, her child's care, ever. In divorce, when divorce does happen or when separations happen, when anything is decided by the courts at this time and there's a separation and they're trying to decide custody, the custody always went with the male because he was the one who made the money. It didn't make any difference if he beat his children. Legally, he could. There was no law protecting his children from being beaten to death by him. If remember, he had the rule of thumb, as long as he didn't beat them with anything bigger around than his thumb. So he was allowed to meet justice and to discipline his children legally. They had no protections until very, very late in the 19th century. And that was only some countries too.
I
So
have a question when you get done. I'm
yes.
sorry. Um, I kind of maybe I might have interpreted this wrong or took it the wrong way. Did the older man that was going to die, that kind of had a crush on her, I blanked out on his name, did he not leave her money? Is that kind of not what they were saying, that maybe he left her money?
Well, there was an understanding that he would consider leaving her money
Yeah,
if she, like, he
yeah,
actually, it was smarmy. It was not good. And the
yeah,
truth is Nora is very pretty, but that
yes,
doesn't necessarily mean good things for her in the future. Dr. Rank was, I mean, he's a weird character. And he's one
yes,
that honestly a lot of people find very uncomfortable because he obviously, I mean, even the fact he's dying, he doesn't tell Torvald,
yeah.
who's supposedly his best friend. And he's very frank with Nora about his attraction to her. And
Yeah, I
so
remember something
we,
about him
there
saying
is
he loved her
certainly
more
the
than
option,
him.
the possibility that, after he's died, that she will get some money from him.
Hmm.
And but how long will that last her? We don't know. How much is it exactly? How much will she be protected from things? Will she be able to go off on her own? I mean, the truth is there are so many unknowns at the end of this play. And that's
Exactly.
because that was reflecting reality. If a
Yeah.
woman were to do something like this in reality in the 1870s in Norway, the likelihood is she would either die, she would become destitute and starve to death, or she could end up being a prostitute. She could end up
Hmm.
in all sorts of bad situations. And the truth is that that affection made her feel wrong, Jordan. And that's why, but the truth is once he dies, whatever he wrote in his will was whatever he wrote in his will. And I think what she would she have accepted the money? I don't know if it had been put in his will, because it's not like that becomes anything, but the fact that he knows, I mean, I think in some ways she's sort of thinking about it like that would help her, but then he makes sure that she knows that he's really, we'll get to that. Well, I'll make sure and look at specifically at that conversation. Um, but the truth is I don't know that Nora, I mean, Nora has no intention. Like maybe she's being, friendly and flirty even. I don't,
Hmm.
she has no intention of ever being unfaithful to Torvald.
Yeah.
And she is all through this whole play, at least from this point on, she's totally hoping that this wonderful thing is going to happen, that she keeps talking about it. But it's that Torvald will step up and do essentially say, I love you no matter what, and forget the judgment part. And
Hmm.
he'll defend her and even take the fall or try to, and she'll make sure he doesn't. I mean, but she contemplates suicide in this. She contemplates a lot of different options, and they're all bad. Like she doesn't
Yeah.
have a good choice to make at this point, even at this point.
Yeah, it made me so mad that, like he was like couldn't stand her, said she was going to be bad, bad, bad mom and couldn't raise the kids. And then all of a sudden, when it was forgiven, then he was like, "Oh, I forgive you. It's fine. It's okay." I wanted to punch him.
Well, and it shows too, it's his moral is relative. His morality is relative. As long as he's not caught or they're
Hmm.
not caught, he's fine pretending to doing essentially what Krogstad did,
Exactly.
pretending that nothing happened. And yet here he was just in the end of the first act bashing Krogstad for exactly that. It is the absolute, it's a perfect example of hypocrisy.
Yeah, I was going to say he's a hypocrite. Yep.
He is. That's why we hate him so much.
Yep.
And I hope so, but hope no, none of you guys watching the video are like, but I liked him, because you need to go back and read it again because he's not a good dude. He's
Yep.
he's he's possessive. He's patronizing. He's way too judgmental and authoritative, and yet he is weak. Because remember, Dr. Rank doesn't even tell him he's dying because he knows that it would set him. He wouldn't be able to take it. So he tells his wife, like, and you need to break it to him because he's not going to be able to take it if I tell him directly. That's weak.
Yes.
Oh, so Addie, you don't like any of the characters? I like Christine. I have to say, I don't think she really does anything wrong. Um, she's a bit of a busybody though, because she decides that Nora's husband needs to know the truth.
Yeah.
And at that point, Nora's husband doesn't need to know the truth. But the truth is it's exactly what Christine does is something that in some ways we all ache to do, to make a couple sit down and look at their marriage for what it really is and not pretend. I mean, this is like, I mean, Torvald is like the epitome of Facebook. Let's talk about how perfect my wife is, and how perfect my children are, and how perfect my job is, and how perfect my life is, and how I'm so perfect at everything that I do, and everything's perfect. And in reality, it's not perfect, and he has no idea because everyone's afraid to tell him the truth.
Exactly.
And I like that Christine and I mean, honestly, I like that Christine offers herself to Krogstad as just a person, not as, oh, well, can you do this for me? There's nothing, what's the word? There's not a present that she's requiring of him in return. It's unrequited. It's like unconditional love. And that's really important. But the truth is there's a lot of toxicity in this. I have to say, and I think I go with Addie in this, I don't know that I like Nora, but I'm beginning to like her more by the end of the play. I think she can turn into someone who is worth knowing and worth being friends with. But I don't think she knows how to do that. The truth is she was a doll at the beginning with her, her dad raised her and coddled her and made her little, she's so precious, and then married her off too young to a man who did exactly the same thing and treated her like a little doll baby. And until you get out of that kind of toxicity, it's hard to know what you're going to be. Yes, I think Christine's almost like, I don't know, like a counselor going, okay, you realize that this marriage is not okay, that there's bad stuff going on with you guys. You're lying to each other, and that's toxic. And he's judging you, and you're taking that judgment and internalizing it, and that's toxic too. So she's trying, once she sees, especially once she sees how Torvald treats Nora, and she realizes, because she's already been told how much Nora hides from Torvald. She says, okay, this is not okay. This is not how you can live. Okay, so now though, we are, what day is it? So we had Christmas Eve yesterday, though it didn't feel very festive. And I think it's really fascinating that this is when it's happening, because it's not. We got through it. The end of Act 1, she's pale with terror, and this is Christmas Eve, and she's not playing with the kids, and yet this is Christmas Eve when all you want to do is play with kids. And so this is of course a candle lit tree. So think of like the Nutcracker, where you can only do that one night, and it even says there are burnt down candle ends. So you have to blow all that stuff out, or you're going to set your house on fire. And she's alone in the room, walking about uneasily. And she's like listening for people to come. Remember how many people came through the door yesterday in the first act. And she says, of course, no one will come today. It's Christmas Day. And then she says, no, nothing's in the letterbox. It's quite empty. So she's worried about Krogstad essentially telling her husband on Christmas Day. And, that he'd sent him a message, through the mail. Well, the truth is the mail doesn't come on Christmas Day. So that's good. And she says, of course he can't. Krogstad doesn't mean it. Such a thing couldn't happen. It's impossible. Like he's going to be merciful, essentially. And they find a fancy dress, but it should be a time when all of this rising action is becoming more and more frightening. It should feel stressful. She's going to get to the end of this act. She's actually at a point where she's like frenetic. She's so anxious, and she's so filled with that kind of, she's really a fear and anxiety and trepidation. And she's a mess by the end of this act. So the nurse brings this fancy dress that she's going to wear for the Tarantella tomorrow. And she says, I should tear it into 100,000 pieces. And the nurse is like, okay, like she doesn't understand. Of course, the nurse doesn't know what's going on. She goes, just mend it a little bit. It'll be okay. Just requires a little patience. And then she goes, I will go and get Mrs. Lynn to come and help me with it. And the nurse is like, you're going to leave again? And she says, you could get ill. And she goes, well, worse than that might happen. And this is the first suggestion she gives us that it will, or I guess it's kind of a foreshadowing that she might consider going out and essentially freezing to death out in the cold. And she says, how are the children? And the nurse says, oh, they're playing with their Christmas presents, but they really want to play with mom. And she goes, I shall not be able to be so much with them now as I was before. Because she's scared to death, she's going to hurt them. I mean, that's really why. And the nurse says, because she's a servant, she can't talk back to Nora. Young children easily get accustomed to anything. And she says, do you think they would forget their mother if she went away altogether? This is sign number 2, that she's thinking not of leaving, of committing suicide. This is not oh, I might leave. She's thinking, I'm going to go and commit suicide so that the forgery that I've done will never come back and get my kids or Torvald. So this is not the same. We don't know this at the time, but this is where she's heading. And she goes, went away altogether. And she says, how could you have the heart to put your child out among strangers? In other words, like, how could you let other people take care of your kids? Okay, Jordan. And she goes, well, I had to leave my children behind if I wanted to be little Nora's nurse. So she has children and they're being raised by other people so that she can be the live-in nurse for these kids. And Nora says, but how could you be willing to do that? And she goes, well, it made it so I could get a really good position. I'm poor. And the guy who got her pregnant didn't do a single thing for me. And she goes, but I suppose your daughter's forgotten you. And she goes, oh no, she wrote to me when she was confirmed and when she was married. So she hasn't seen her. And now the woman is grown up and married. It's kind of awful. But servants it was extremely rare for servants, A, to be allowed to be married, or B, to be allowed to have children or have those children anywhere underfoot. I mean, if they did have children, the children were kept back with their parents or something like that, and they'd come to the place where they were servants and they'd just work all day and then they'd go back home. But most servants were live-in servants. And so like this nurse, she would sleep in a room right off the nursery and she would watch them 24/7. And oh, hey, Jordan. And so, that's not an easy thing either. And in some ways, Nora is recognizing that. And it's the first time she's really listening. And that's important because she's recognizing that someone who was who was close to her, she raised her as when she was a child. So Nora herself wasn't really raised by her own parents. She was really raised by this nurse. It reminds me, this whole scene actually reminds me of The Help and the women who come in and they cook and they take care of the children. And that how close those servants get to these children and how much they do to help their self-esteem, to help raise them. And that's kind of what Nurse is doing. And so she goes, you were a good mother to me when I was little. And so she had a profound effect on Nora. And she goes, little Nora, poor dear, had no other mother but me because she was raised by her father. And she says, if my little ones had no other mother, I'm sure you would. In other words, she's saying, I'm sure you would take good care of them too. And then she can't go that far. She can't say it. And so she says, go into them. Now I have to do something else. So she's going to go and put on her dress or something like that. But she will not probably, that's the thing is that can't let herself go and be close to her children again because she's so scared of what will happen. And so she's trying hard not to think about all the stuff, but the thoughts keep coming back. So she's if only I could be sure nothing would happen here in the meantime. And if only no one would come. Like she says, I want to go out and see Christine, but I don't. What if somebody puts something in the mailbox in the meantime? Because it's a locked mailbox. And she goes, no one will come. Only I must not think about it. She's going kind of insane. And then she's counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then she screams because she hears someone at the door. Literally, she's that freaked out already. And it's going to get worse. And who is it? The person she was going to go see. And she says, so she's like, yay, it's Christine. But she goes, there's no one else out there, is there? And Mrs. Lynn said, I heard you were asking for me. She goes, yeah. She goes, look here, tomorrow evening, there's a fancy dress ball who live above us, at the Steinborgs who live above us. And Torvald wants me to go as a Neapolitan fisher girl and dance the tarantella. And Mrs. Lynn says, I see you are going to keep up the character. And she says, yes, Torvald wants me to. Look, here is the dress. Torvald had made it. In other words, what she's really saying, what Mrs. Lynn is really saying is, are we still pretending everything's great? It's not just, oh, you're going to play a character, but that she's playing a character. It has a double meaning. And Mrs. Lynn essentially says, oh, I can help fix it. Is it only some of the trimming coming unsewn here and there? Needle and thread? Okay, then we can totally take it. And really, Mrs. Lynn is the one who ends up fixing her dress. Nora doesn't. Nora's like, oh, it's nice of you, you know. And then she gets up and walks around. And essentially, what happens? What they're discussing things. She goes, I don't think yesterday was as pleasant as usual. In other words, it wasn't as fun a party as you say, you know, it seemed fun to you. And then she says, is Dr. Rank always as depressed as he was? And she says, no, he's not usually that depressed. And he was kind of a grumpy old man yesterday. But he has consumption of the spine, which is God knows what that means. Because consumption was used as a regular name for all lung maladies. So I don't know what consumption of the spine means. I mean, it could be that he had cancer. We just don't know. But he's been sick for a long time. And she says, well, now tuberculosis was one disease that consumption covered. But the truth is it could, like pneumonia. If you got pneumonia and your lungs filled with fluid and then you died because you couldn't breathe, they'd call that consumption. I mean, so anything where you get to the point where you really can't breathe, your lungs aren't working. I mean, even if they misdiagnosed asthma or something, I mean, most people who had severe asthma did not live very long. Even as children, they could die just because there weren't really any treatments. They didn't understand what it was. And so it came under the umbrella of lung disease, you know, and they just used consumption for all of that. So it's hard to know, even from history books, what did people really die of? Who knows? It all said consumption. No, it's consumption or a bunch of wasting disease, you know, stuff like that. And she says, does Dr. Rank come here every day? And she says, oh, yes, he's Torvald's most intimate friend. He's just like one of the family. And she says, well, is he sincere? And she says, no, he doesn't lie. And she goes, well, it's weird because he when he heard my name, he said, oh, the Vampire Diaries. He says every time I hear, you know, when he heard my name, he said, oh, I heard your name. I hear your name mentioned in the house all the time. But then your husband didn't have the slightest idea who it was. And this is what Nora said. She goes, Torvald is so absolutely fond of me that he wants me absolutely to himself, as he says. This is classic narcissism. At first, he used to seem almost jealous if I mentioned any of the dear folk at home, so naturally I gave up doing so. But I often talk about such things with Dr. Rank. Yes. But yeah, who knows what it actually was. It could have been, honestly, it could have been pneumonia, it could have been asthma, it could have been some other kind of respiratory disease. So, so she says, but I talked to Dr. Rank about you, even though I'm not allowed, really not allowed to talk to Torvald about you, because he doesn't like to hear about other people. He only likes to hear about himself, which is so telling. And she goes, listen to me. This really freaks Nora out, Mrs. Lind out. She goes, you're still like very like a child in many things, and I'm older than you in many ways, and I have more experience. You shouldn't be talking to Dr. Rank. You ought to make an end of it with Dr. Rank. And she's like, why? And she goes, first, you talked some nonsense about a rich admirer who was going to leave you money. And she goes, an admirer doesn't even exist. But what then? She goes, is Dr. Rank a man of means? She goes, he is, has no one, and he has no one to provide for. And he comes here every day. And then she says, well, how can this well-bred man be so tactless? And Mrs. Lind says, don't prevaricate. In other words, don't lie and say you don't understand me. She's saying that she thinks Dr. Rank, and at least there could be an underlying relationship between her and Nora. It looks bad. And she goes, a friend of ours who comes every day, that would do you realize what a horribly painful position that would be if I tell him you can't come around anyway? But then she said, then he really isn't a friend, is he? Then she says, then it really isn't he. So he's not the benefactor, but he is. And she says, it's funny because he had no money to lend when she needed the 250 pounds, but now he came into his money later. And she says, I think that was lucky for you. Now, why would she say that? Because if Dr. Rank had lent her the money, what would he want?
Thanks.
He would want Nora. Yeah.
Yeah. This is simply put.
And Mrs. Lind, she just came into all this and she's already reading that.
Yeah.
She already says, look, you don't want to owe that guy money because he will make you pay for it.
Yeah.
And then she says, I have no reason to think that would ever be necessary. She goes, I'm quite sure if I told Dr. Rank, and she says, behind your husband's back. And she can't do that. Nora knows there's something not right about her relationship with, it's more than flirtation. And even if it's not on her side, she's just flirting. She knows Dr. Rank holds her in affection.
Yeah.
And she's been lying to herself about it. And then, so she's just like, no, she goes, it doesn't matter. You pay off a debt, you get your bond back, don't you? So she's just determined she's going to pay pay Krogstad back. And she goes, yes, as a matter of course. And she goes, I can tear it into 100,000 pieces, that bond. And so she'll never be called on the carpet about it. And then Mrs. Lind says, you're lying. You are concealing something from me. And she says, do I look as if I were? And she says, something has happened to you since yesterday morning. Of course, this is where, she's actually interrupted, but she's like, okay, Christine's given her the opening. Tell me what happened so that she can tell her about Krogstad, about the threats, about what's going to happen, stuff like that. And then as soon as she hears that Torvald's here, she goes, oh no, he's come home. Do you mind going into the children for at present? Torvald can't bear to see dressmaking going on. Like, what is that?
Mm.
He must be the most touchy, eggshell kind of guy, like, ever.
Mm-hmm.
And she's been on pins and needles for a decade now. So, and Helmer says, as soon as he comes in, he goes, was that the dressmaker? And he goes, no. She goes, no, it's Christine. She's helping me with the dress. And all he does is, of course, brag about what a great idea he came up with. And she says, but don't you think it's nice of me too, to do as you wish? And he goes, nice? Because you do as your husband wishes? Well, you little rogue, I'm sure you do not mean it in that way. In other words, her job is to do what he wants.
Mm.
Which is, I mean, even though notice how they never say these things, but they're so understood.
Yeah.
Like, she's a rogue for bringing it up. But that's your job. And like, why would I, put a button on you for that? Because that's your whole, when you disobey me, you're not Jordan, you don't like it either. Okay, yeah, it makes me throw up just a little bit in my mouth. It's just not good.
Mm-hmm.
And she says, I suppose you're going to work. And he goes, look at that. I've just been into the bank. Turns to go to his room, and she says his name. He goes, yeah. If your little squirrel were to ask you something very, very prettily. So she puts on that role that he gives her.
Mm-hmm.
Would you do it? And he goes, I want to hear what it is. And she goes, your little squirrel would do all the things you like if you do what she wants. And he says, come on, tell me. Your skylark would, and he's getting a little irritated. Yet this is the same language that he uses against her. She says, I would play the fairy and dance for you in the moonlight, Torvald. And he says, you're not going to ask the same thing you asked before. And she goes, yes, please. And he goes, oh, really? You're willing to defend Krogstad again? And despite the fact that he made it clear, Krogstad makes him sick, and he doesn't ever want to hear her defend him again. He's I mean, this is not what she should be doing. This is not going to get anywhere with Torvald. And she says, you can't take away Krogstad's post. And he goes, I gave it to Mrs. Lind, which you asked me to do. And she goes, well, can't you dismiss some other clerk instead of Krogstad? Which is so insensitive. That's why I say Nora is not a person that we like at the beginning. We have to learn she has to stop being so flippant. But that's what Torvald is too. And he gets mad at her. Because you chose to give him a thoughtless promise that you would speak for him. Of course, he has no idea what's actually underlying that. And she says, that's not the reason. It's for your own sake. What if he does some harm and maligns you, And he goes, just because, you're worried about all this other stuff. She goes, naturally, you're thinking of your father. And her father had malicious, stuff written about him. And they would have procured his dismissal of the department had I not sent you over to inquire into it. And he says, there's an important difference between your father and me. Your father did bad things. That's what he's saying. He says, your father's reputation as a public official was not above suspicion. Mine is. Now, he thinks it is. But of course, having a wife who's up for fraud or forgery, nope, no longer is he above suspicion, but he doesn't know any of that. And so she's trying not to tell him and yet warn him. And she's not getting through to him at all. And then he says, which makes no sense, because you asked me to keep him in his job, I have no choice but to fire him. It is already known at the bank that I mean to dismiss Krogstad. It's about to get out now that the new manager has changed his mind at his wife's bidding. And she's like, well, what if it did? And now he calls her obstinate. He makes fun of her. Oh, and he talks about how ridiculous that would be if she had any sway over him. And besides that, of course, remember, Krogstad makes him sick just to be in the same room. She says his moral failings I might have perhaps overlooked if necessary. And he even says he's a good worker too. But I knew him when we were boys. And we were once on very intimate terms. And now in my job, he lays no restraint on himself when other people are present. So he doesn't say, "Oh, yes, Mr. Helmer." He calls him a friend because they know each other from school time, which normally, you're pretty informal with people. On the contrary, he thinks it's okay to be familiar with me. And this is where we get to the crux of it. It's not about his past immorality or the forgery that he did a long time ago. It's about the fact that Torvald doesn't feel comfortable with him being so informal at work with him. And then Nora says, "You can't possibly mean that." And he goes, "Why not?" "Because it's narrow-minded." "What are you saying?" "Narrow-minded." Now he gets all mad. "Do you think I am narrow-minded?" "Well, yeah."
Hmm.
But she says, "No, just the opposite, dear." And so I'm just telling you that sounds narrow-minded, and I know you're not narrow-minded, and so you won't pick to do that. She's kind of prevaricating. She's going around because she can't tell him anything directly. When she did, right here, which we agreed with, I mean, I don't have any problem. I think it's narrow-minded. I'm like, really? That's why you're going to fire him? It's terrible. Talk to him and say, "Dude, could you call me Mr. Helmer while we're at work?" That's all I would ever do, if that was important to me, which it's not. But he could talk to him, and instead he's going to fire him because of that. And so she calls it narrow-minded, though, and he loses his mind. And he starts shouting. And he says, "I'm going to settle it." He says, "Look here, take this letter and go downstairs with it at once, find a messenger." And essentially, what's the letter say?
That is fine.
What is today? Christmas Day. Here,
Yeah.
take the letter, take it down right now, and make sure it gets delivered to his house. On Christmas Day, you're fired.
That's sad.
It's awful. And so Nora, though, she's fighting him on this. I mean, she's right about the narrow-minded, but mostly she's struggling with him on this because she's desperately afraid. It's not because she's looking at what he's doing to Krogstad and thinking, "Wow, that's really unfair." She's more out to help herself. And he says, "It's too late." And she goes, "Yes, it's too late." And he has no idea what that means. We know what that means. And he says, "Well, I can forgive your anxiety, although it's really an insult. Why would I be afraid of that man? But I forgive you, since it is such an eloquent witness to your great love for me." I mean, he really is. He's classic narcissist. And that is as it should be, my own darling Nora. So he is it's like almost like he's the doll. He's in his dollhouse of perfect land, and there's nothing she can say that can shatter any of that. But then he says, "Come what will, you may be sure I shall have both courage and strength if they be needed. You will see I am man enough to take everything upon myself." This is his first big lie boast. And she says, "What do you mean by that?" He goes, "Everything I say." And she says, "You will never have to do that." Now, he doesn't know what she's talking about. She's looking at his statement, "I am man enough to take everything upon myself," as a statement that he's going to take the fall for everything. And she says, "You can't do that. And you will never have to." And that again goes back to what she needs to do, that she's going to commit suicide so that he never has to make that choice. Well, the truth is, he, on the outside, but the thing is too, and this is important to understand, Tracy, because she wrote, "I thought he fired him also for the forgery." The truth is he didn't do the forgery at his work. And Helmer
Yeah.
knew about the forgery long before he ever got this job.
Yeah.
And so the suggestion that he gives, "Oh, well, he calls me familiarly and blah, blah, blah," that suggests that that's why he's taking action right now. Like he finally is in the position of authority where he can do it, and he's wanted to get rid of Krogstad for a while. And it sounds like it's as much as Krogstad is familiar with him as it is that Krogstad once a long time ago did something he shouldn't
Yeah.
have done. And knowing
probably using
Homer
that
and
as
how
an
much he
excuse
lives
to
in La La
justify it.
Land,
Yeah.
it sounds good, but I don't think, I mean, that's not why he's suddenly fired, because years ago he committed forgery. That's because Helmer knew about it then. Okay, so he says, that's right. He goes, we're going to share it as man and wife should. That's how it shall be. And he's like, don't be scared. I'm going to take everything. We're going to be all right.
Hmm.
And she said he was capable of doing it. He will do it. He will do it in spite of everything. And so he's going to take all of it on himself. That's that wonderful thing that her husband's going to do. And she doesn't want that to happen. She doesn't want anything to happen to Torvald. And so Rank comes in and he's ready to talk to Torvald, but Torvald just went in his office and everything, and he wants her to talk to Rank for a while. And she says, I know, you know very well, I always have time for you. That's a little flirtatious.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you guys noticed it too?
Yeah.
And he goes, I shall make use of as much of it as I can. That's what he read. And she goes, and she calls him on it. Now, she might not have said anything had she not just had that conversation with Christine, where she's like, I don't think you want to owe that man money. I don't think you want him to gift you any money because that would be bad. And so now she's questioning the flirtatiousness. And he goes, well, does that alarm you? And she goes, it's such a strange way of putting it. Is anything likely to happen? And he says, nothing but what I have long been prepared for, but I certainly didn't expect it to happen so soon. And then we get to the crux of what's going on. He's probably a little more reckless because he knows he's dying.
Mm-hmm.
It's all up with me and it can't be helped. And she goes, it's no use lying about it. She goes, I'm the most wretched of all my patients. Lately, I've been taking stock of my internal economy. Bankrupt. Probably within a month, I shall lie rotting in the churchyard. It's not going to be that long, actually. But I'm not going to, I mean, everybody knows this already. But she says, what an ugly thing to say, but it's truthful. It actually is truthful. He does die.
Yeah.
And so, but of course, that's why he's depressed too. I would be depressed if I knew I was going to die really soon. So
Okay.
why would anyone take it happily? I
Yeah.
totally get that. I don't judge him for that. But he goes, there's something I want to tell you. Helmer's refined nature gives him an unconquerable disgust at everything that is ugly. Now this shows, remember, there's so much he doesn't like to see somebody sewing on a garment. I'm like, why? Because it's not perfect. I don't know. But he says, I won't have him in my sick room. And there are people who are they should never be in a person's sick room. They're just not cut out for that. And it even says, I bar my door to him. As soon as I'm quite certain that the worst has come, I shall send you my card with the black cross on it. Then you will know that the loathsome end has begun. And no visiting. And I totally understand that. People get to have their, they get to die their way, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
And she says, and I wanted you so much to be in a really good humor. And he goes, with death stalking beside me? No. And and then she even tells him, do talk of something cheerful. So she's trying to do what Torvald does. Let's urge you
Yeah.
to be happy, smile. Wait, I'm dying. But I know, smile. Well, no, we're not going to do that. And essentially he blames it on his dad, which makes no sense. Of course, we know medically that makes no sense. But he certainly can, all of the stuff he's talking about, I'm sure he ate himself. And so, and it's probably a lot to do with that, the port and the champagne. And he might be suffering from liver failure for all we know. We just don't know. But, in some ways he just, you know, he finally says, he goes, especially that they should revenge themselves on the unlucky bones of those who have not had the satisfaction of enjoying them. And she goes, yes, that's the saddest part of all. And he looks at her and she goes, why did you smile? And they're both kind of like, it's a very weird exchange. And he
Yeah.
says, you are a greater rascal than I thought. And she says, so she pleads, don't let death take you away from Torvald and me. And he says, it's a loss you would easily recover from. Those who are gone are soon forgotten. And he says that they'll make new friends when he's gone. And he talks about Mrs. Lynde. And she says, you're not jealous of her. And he goes, yep.
Hmm.
She will be my successor in this house. When I'm done for this woman, she's like, shh, she's here. And he's like, oh, she's here today again. See?
Hmm.
And so she sits down and she says, but be nice now, Dr. Rank. I'm going to dance tomorrow. You can all be happy. And she says, you can imagine I'm doing it all for you, which is a little bit beyond the
Yeah.
flirtation. And then she adds, and for Torvald too, of course. But then what does she show him?
Her stockings.
Like, what in the world is she doing?
Mm-hmm.
And he's even going, that's Norwegian for but she's like literally holding them up, like, see? And then she hits him lightly on the ear with the stockings. And then he says, and what other nice things am I allowed to see? Okay, Jordan, you're this funny. Nora does need to stop showing men her underpants. Yes. Honestly, no one needs to see anybody's underpants. There's a reason we have pants to cover
Mm-hmm.
the underpants. And he says, so what else am I now allowed to see? And she says, not a single thing for being so naughty. Absolute flirtation.
Yes.
And then he becomes very honest in a not so great way. Yes, underpants because they go under something else. That's right. And she says, if I asked you for a big proof of your friendship, a tremendously big favor, he'd love to do it. He'd love to do something for her. And she says, I can't tell you what. He goes, well, tell me what it is. I'll do whatever. And she says, I can't. It's something out of all reason. It means advice and help and a favor. And she says, I know you are my truest dear and best friend, which he's not. So I will tell you what it is. And she says, you know how Torvald loves me. And then he says, so she's really at that point where she might even, we're inkling like, oh, she's going to ask him for money.
Yeah.
As the favor. And so she says, you know, Torvald loved me. He would never for a moment hesitate to give his life for me. And that's where she's going, that he's going to do that if she's exposed. And so she needs money. And he said, but as soon as she says that, he says, Nora, do you think he's the only one? And he essentially says, I would give my life for your sake. I was determined you should know it before I went away, and there will never be a better opportunity than this. And now you know that you can trust me as you would trust no one else. And he has crossed a line. Like that's one of those unwritten, yeah, you don't, there's flirtation and then there's that, and you don't do that. Because it changes the relationship instantly.
But to me, she brought a lot of that on herself. I mean,
Oh, she
showing her
did.
underpants and all that.
Oh, absolutely.
If I was a dying man, I would take it the exact same way, and I
Well,
would
and
go
that's the
for it.
thing too, he's dying.
Yeah, why not go for it?
Well, I mean, what does he have to lose?
Yeah, exactly.
And now he says, now that, but you know, you have me to command. Won't you say something now? And she will not. And she's right to not bring it up. Now that she knows this, she can't do the other thing. She shouldn't have done it before either, but you know, that's not, she can't,
Hmm.
she can't ask him of that. But the truth is if she tells, yeah, I mean, why shouldn't he tell her? And the truth is, it's again, where do the uncomfortable moments happen in this play? When people are honest.
Yeah.
And yet Christine, you know, the truth is when you sit down with a couple, I don't know if you guys have ever done couples therapy or anything like it, but couples go wrong when they don't talk to each other. They have to be honest. If they lie, like if you say, oh, it's the best baked beans I've ever had, and they were terrible, well, your spouse is going to keep making baked beans the same way, and then you're going to be upset that those baked beans taste terrible and you have to keep eating them. Well, don't lie. You have to say, dude, these baked beans are not good. Let's just go get something, you know. And it's better to go through the uncomfortable moments with honesty than lie. Right. And it's that
Yeah.
that truthful communication. But remember, Nora's been trained well. Torvald will not take honesty. Your job is to be a squirrel and a bird and pretend, because that makes him happy. He doesn't want to see the messy stuff. He doesn't want to see things unfinished. He wants to see things perfect. And that's not what, so this is where the discomfort comes. When we get to reality, then we get to discomfort. And yet that's because you've been playing, I mean, these people have all been in La La Land, and they've been in the doll's house. And so trying to get to that point of honesty, I mean, the fact that Rank can't even tell Torvald, hey, I'm dying, that's a problem.
Yeah.
That person is not your best friend if you can't tell them. But we have gone way over. Let's see where I am now in the, okay, we are over half. So hopefully we'll see what we can go a little more lickety spit. The truth is at the end, it all kind of falls together. So it will, you know, it after the Tarantella happens, and then everything, the letter after letter after letter happen. It's actually very neatly done, the way that he's kind of paced everything in this play. But so it's not much time before we're gonna get to the end. So, and I'm sad for Dr. Rank too. I mean, first of all, I'm sad because he's dying. And he
Yeah.
did kind of misread her. And the truth is the reason he would help her out is because he's in love with her. And
Yeah.
yet she can't accept that because she has to keep the relationship with her and Torvald alive, even if it's false. And it is kind of, I mean, poor Rank. I feel sorry for him, but he is just a bit smarmy. It's just, I just can't get it. Oh, he still is. He crossed a line that he shouldn't have crossed. But again, he's on his deathbed, so I make allowances for that. Do you guys have any other comments before we go? I'm going to go ahead and stop the recorder.